Well, the first two words of my title, Family Archives, may have given too many hostages to fortune. So I'm going to begin by saying how I'm using them. First, archives. There's a long discussion of the term archive in papyrological discourse, which I do not need to recount. I'm adopting the broad understanding used by Trismegistos archives and justified in Bart van Beek's paper at the Helsinki Papyrological Congress, drawing in its turn on the typology established by Andrea Jurgens. The actual circumstances and characteristics of the individual archives, however, are of some interest for the questions I shall be discussing. Family is not simpler. Van Beek apparently equates family and private, whereas Katalijn van Dorpen has noted the distinction to be made between personal and family, the latter requiring more than one generation to fit the definition. But Trismegistos has not adopted this distinction in any significant way. When I looked, I could find only one archive called personal, that of Leon from the Ptolemaic period. And I've not actually been able to discover any consistent principle for the use of family or private in Trismegistos. Although private does include business archives, apparently distinguished from family archives. So I have adopted, again, a broad definition, figuring it's better to include than to exclude. I'm including a number of the so-called private archives wherever they're not limited to extra-familial business. The broad question that interests me here, as on a number of other occasions, some of which Sabina mentioned, is the fashion in which the contours of our evidence affect the ways we write the social and economic history of Egypt in late antiquity. Again, using that term in the broader sense that spans the period from Diocletian to the Arab conquest, rather than in the narrower definition that I used in Egypt in late antiquity. But my focus today is a bit narrower and simpler. How does the role of family archives in history writing change over time, and why? The tremendous growth in the study of the archives of the Apiones and of the family of Dioscorus of Aphrodito, both of which you've heard about already in this conference, in the time since I wrote Egypt in late antiquity, has brought into the foreground the centrality of archives in shaping the questions that we can ask and do ask about particular times and places, and our dependence on the nature of these archives for how we approach the subject. The contrast between the Oxyrhynchos of the Apiones and the Aphrodito of Dioscorus has given rise to quite a bit of rewarding discussion, both of substance and of method, about what kind of society 6th century Egypt was, and to what extent our picture of that society has been dictated by the character of those archives. That we would ask this question is in part a reflection of how few other substantial archives we have from the period after the middle of the 5th century. And that fact leads me to look back at the span from Diocletian to the first half of the 5th century and the contrast that it presents in its relative abundance of archives, which certainly had a profound impact on how I approached the task of describing that period. In particular, the role of the Kuranes family archives is hard to escape. So I shall take a few minutes today to look at the archival picture of the whole late antique period and think about the reasons why it looks as it does and about its impact on our history writing. The 4th century does, in fact, in retrospect, seem like a golden age for family archives. We find them coming from both village and city settings. It is probable that all of them come from excavations, whether scientific or mostly clandestine, of settlement areas, rather than having been found in external dumps. The core archives here are those of Isidorus, of course, of Ion and Valerius, and then of Tatuace, all from Caranese, of Palmur from Kelis, of the ostraca of Serenus from Trimithus, which are not yet shown as an archive in Trismegistos, of the necrotophoi of Cusus, bridging the period from the 230s to 314, the multi-generational archive of Carite, Adelphius, and Asclepiades from Hermopolis, and the archives of Ammon, Scholasticos, and Alopax from Panopolis. For some of these, we know quite a lot about the circumstances of discovery. The Kelis papyri were all found in controlled excavations, and in particular of 4th century houses in Area A. Probably none of the papers of the inhabitants of these houses were found in a primary use context, as pieces were found scattered across houses and in the streets, as well as in the houses themselves. But if the material was all discarded, at least it was thrown away more or less where it had been used. The ostraca of Serenus from Trimithus were found on occupation floors in both his house and the adjoining stables and storage building. The papers of the necrotophoi were acquired on the antiquities market in the 1890s, but local informants, many decades later, told Françoise Dunant that they had come from a house in the necropolis at Douche. Plausible, even if hardly certain. Ammon and Alopax are both archives acquired on the antiquities market, and although a certain amount of the acquisition history can be traced, Trismegistos can report no information on the original circumstances of discovery of either of them. The situation with Caranese is more complicated. The published papyri of the 3 connected family archives that I mentioned come more or less entirely from purchases on the antiquities market, mainly in the 1920s. But there are papyri in the Michigan collection coming from the Caranese excavations of the 1920s and 1930s that are parts of these archives. Little of this material has been published so far. A project initiated by Graham Claytor and involving also Rodney Ast, Jennifer Sheridan Moss, and me aims to publish all of this material and to look closely at the find context information for all of the excavated pieces to try to push forward our knowledge of the find places of these archives. It is a reasonable surmise that they come, like some other Caranese archives, from storage or dump sites rather than primary domestic use locations. But again, dumps within the settlement area. About the Hermopolitan family archives, perhaps best described with Fritz Mithoff as the archive of Asclepiades and his parents and grandmother, Demetria, alias Ammonia in that case, nothing is known of the find circumstances. Klaas Borp established that the Viennese component of this archive came as a single acquisition, probably in 1886. He surmises that the Cairo parts of the archive were acquired around the same time. The absence of Oxyrhynchos from this list is striking. The entire 3rd to 4th century span there yields only 4 private archives: Diogenes alias Turbiina, Serenus, Appia, and Serapion alias Apollyonos and his sons. These are mostly small, with Diogenes having just 4 texts, Appia having only 18 texts scattered across 8 collections, which tells you right away that that was an antiquities market job, and Serenus just 10 texts, all in P. Oxy. The only larger instance is the classic case of Serapion alias Apollyonos, which should certainly be called a family archive, as it includes multiple generations. but its 58 texts are very scattered across 16 collections. The common thread in the Oxyrhynchite picture is probably an archaeological phenomenon. All of these were really found in external dumps, whether by Grenfell and Hunt, by the Italian mission, or by private individuals, and not in original domestic contexts or even domestic discarding. Of course, Oxyrhynchos totally dominates discussion of public institutions in the 4th century, thanks to the masses of official documents found in the dump, covering the period down to the 370s very richly. So the contrast between the public and the private sides of the Oxyrhynchite documentation is striking. Now, it is no surprise that the 5th century is less rich in family archives, as it is, after all, poorer in almost all respects in our documentation. The most striking aspect, apart from small numbers, is that none of the archives come from villages. The 3 family archives from urban settings were all apparently deposited in the 6th or 7th centuries, thus lasting for multiple generations. One of them, of course, is the massive Apiones archive, which does go back to the 5th century. But it is not clear that it should properly be classified as a family archive. The papers, in fact, reflect a business office operating at or probably just outside the known capital on behalf of the family, rather than really being a collection of family papers per se. Also from Oxyrhynchos is the small archive concerning Flavius Eulogius and his sons Apphus and Martyrios, also composed of business papers that could have come from such an office, although, if so, it is that of a much lesser magnate than the Apiones or Anastasia. Most of the 14 certain texts of Eulogius and his sons were found in the first season of the Oxyrhynchos excavations, 3 more from a return to the same mound in the 6th season, and 1 from Bell's papyrus cartel, probably a clandestine find from the same mound. From Hermopolis in the 5th century, we have the substantial and true family archive of Taurinus and his descendants, which is much more like the 4th century family archives in its character than are the Oxyrhynchite archives. Its 56 certain, perhaps up to 75 texts, all in Berlin, were mostly found by Rubenson in 1905 in the excavation of a dump, and a few less precisely documented items may come from the same find. It seems, in fact, to be a sprawling assemblage of documents reflecting several families. For the most part, the documents are characteristic of patrimonial management of a wealthy urban family with a military background, but not of the class of the great Oxyrhynchite magnates. Finally, the earliest document of the Patermuthus archive from Aswan belongs to the 5th century, but it is an outlier, of course, in a group that is otherwise mainly 6th century and early 7th century. The 6th century documentation is dominated by the Apiones and, of course, the Aphrodito archives of Dioscorus and Phoibamon. The first found at the beginning of the 20th century in a single location in Komishkau. The second discovered only in the 1940s and reaching the market in dispersed fashion without reliable provenance information. It is not doubtful, however, that both were found in a settlement context at Aphrodito. The Oxyrhynchite offers also from this century, apart from what the archives I've already mentioned, the archive of another magnate, Anastasia. The small bilingual archive of contracts involving the purple dealer, Papyrios, is 6th and 7th century and spans Panopolis and This. It was found in the 19th century, and apparently nothing can be recovered of the fine circumstances. Patermuthus, with more than 50 texts in Greek and Coptic, was acquired by purchase, divided in the process between London and Munich. It has been shown by Jitse Dijkstra that this archive was found in clandestine excavations in the ruins of Aswan, and not Elephantine, north of the Cataract Hotel, and thus belongs to an urban milieu. Dijkstra, in fact, concludes that it is likely that Patermuthus lived in this part of town, and that, quote, the papyri would then have been disposed of after his death in or near his house, unquote. The 7th century brings the endings of some archives that I've already mentioned, but not much new. There is the anomalous listing in Trismegistos of the archive of the sons of Christophorus, but it in fact attributes no texts at all to this archive on the basis of a study by Jean-Luc Fournet, shown still as forthcoming, and which, as far as I know, still is. So that's a ghost archive. And then at Edfu we get the handful of texts of the archive of Philemon and Thecla, that is to say the massive Budge papyrus in Coptic, and 3 London texts in Greek, all concerning a house, which were, as Arthur Schiller reports, seemingly unearthed by Sebak diggers in the early years of the 20th century, probably in a house in the Tell of Edfu, as Wilken surmised long ago. And finally, the small archive or dossier of another magnate with fiscal responsibilities, Sophia, the patrician, perhaps the mother of Theodosius, Theodosiopolite in content and found in Arsinoe as part of the great mass of documents that came on the market from that site in the late 19th century. Though as far as I know, nobody can tell where at Kimon Fares they were found. As to the 8th century, which is really beyond my scope, the archives are mainly monastic or official in character, but of course I have to mention the business papers of Kaloja and her family, perhaps the most salient family papers, if one can call Ostrika papers, of this period, going back as far perhaps as Kaloja's grandmother Catherone, as St. Apako has argued. So how are we to interpret these data? If one simply looked at the list quantitatively, the pattern of discovery and survival might appear simply to comfort theories of decline and not much else. But of course, this really doesn't do much more than track the overall pattern of documentation in the period. You saw earlier the graph from Habermann's article of nearly 20 years ago, which wouldn't look a lot different today. And things have kind of come down quite dramatically in the later centuries. So the decline in family archives is probably in itself not of a great deal of significance. The same can be said, I think, for the almost total domination of city archives rather than village, with Aphrodito being the only village to provide family archives after the 4th century until we reach Jaman. But again, the same is largely true of our documentation in general, with only minor exceptions. So these 2 points argue for what I would call an archaeological interpretation. Contingent factors have led to few excavations of city and village sites, and particularly few of village sites, from the last centuries of Roman rule. And in particular, to few excavations of domestic contexts, even of the secondary and tertiary deposits from domestic contexts that should be the most promising sources of such archives. We would not in general expect to find monastic context yielding family archives, although I can't be completely sure that that couldn't happen. The find, of course, of the quasi-family archive in the Church of Petra makes one wonder just what the possibilities would be. So the numbers of late family archives thus do not have any special significance. But instead, I would suggest that their importance lies in their very existence and in the types of documents included. The village elites, the moneylenders, the urban artisans, and the metropolitan landowners, who are the creators of these various archives, are merely the latest representatives of the social groups that we know very well from earlier centuries, accumulating the documentation of their acquisition and management of land, the defense of their rights and status, the creation and dissolution of family relationships, the payment of taxes, the borrowing and lending of money, and so on, with documents of types that we are very familiar with. This phenomenon points to a stability both of substance and of documentation across a period of time that certainly saw many other changes in almost any other domain that you can think of. The number of archives that close shortly before the Persian invasion might lead one to ask if the stability breaks down at that time. On the whole, the Philemon and Thecla papers, along with the later parts of the Phoibamon archive and then the Kaloja archive, would lead one to say that actually things don't seem to have changed all that much in this respect anyway. But of course there is a substantial shift in this period toward the use of Coptic for true legal documents, a subject most recently and comprehensively treated in Jean-Luc Fournet's Rostovstev lectures that I saw this spring. But despite that shift, the continuity in documentation practices and in the normal activities of the property parts of society, both rural and urban, seem to me more striking than the changes. Thank you.